$920 million every single month. That's not a rounding error. That is the check Google is writing every 30 days to a rocket company. Not for satellites, not for launch services, for raw computing power, for GPU horsepower sitting in data centers in Memphis, Tennessee. And here's the twist that reframes everything. Back in 2021, it was SpaceX that was renting from Google. SpaceX was the client. Google was the landlord, the infrastructure giant, the one holding all the power. 5 years later, the entire relationship has flipped completely on its head. Google, one of the greatest technology infrastructure companies ever assembled, now rents computing capacity from the people who build rockets. That is where we're starting today, and I promise you by the time we're done, that role reversal is going to make a lot more sense and reveal something profound about where artificial intelligence, computing, and possibly the future of space itself are all heading at the same time. Welcome to Mindcast. I'm Will. This is the show where we take the biggest, most complex stories shaping our world and strip them down to the insights that actually matter, the ideas that change how you see things. Today, we are going deep on one deal, a single contract between Alphabet, Google's parent company, and SpaceX. $30 billion, disclosed in June 2026. And on the surface, it looks like a straightforward business arrangement. Google needs computing power, SpaceX has it, money changes hands. But underneath that surface is a story about the global AI arms race, a brilliant decade-long financial strategy that almost nobody is talking about, and a vision for the future of computing infrastructure that literally involves leaving the planet. Here's what I want you to walk away with today. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why the AI compute shortage is far more severe than most people realize. You'll understand how SpaceX became the world's most powerful GPU landlord almost overnight, and you'll see the financial architecture connecting all of this, including why Google paying SpaceX billions of dollars actually makes Google richer at the same time. Stay with me. It's worth it. Let's start with the first major insight, the deal itself and the demand crisis that made it necessary. In June of 2026, Google formally disclosed, through an amended SEC filing, that it had agreed to pay SpaceX $920 million per month for access to a dedicated cluster of approximately 110,000 Nvidia GPUs. The hardware lives in what's called the Colossus Complex, 2 data center facilities in Memphis, Tennessee, and South Haven, Mississippi. The full operational term runs from October 2026 through June 2029. That's 33 months. At full rate, the contract tops out at around $30.4 billion. Now, 2 things matter enormously here that most headlines skip right past. First, what does 110,000 GPUs actually mean? Think of it this way. A single high-end Nvidia H100 chip, the kind powering the most advanced AI systems in the world right now, costs somewhere between $25,000 and $40,000 on the open market. 110,000 of them packed into a single dedicated cluster with all the supporting CPUs, memory, and networking infrastructure. That is an almost incomprehensible concentration of silicon, one of the largest dedicated AI compute clusters ever assembled, ring-fenced entirely for Google's internal use. Second, that $30 billion number is a ceiling, not a floor. After December 31st, 2026, either party can walk away from the contract with just 90 days written notice. So the real story here isn't $30 billion locked in. The real story is that Google needed this hardware so urgently that it was willing to commit to nearly $1 billion a month with an exit clause and call it bridge capacity. That word, bridge, tells you everything about the severity of what's happening inside Google. So why does Google, a company that invented the modern data center, that operates one of the most sophisticated global cloud networks on Earth, that revised its capital expenditure forecast in 2026 to between $180 and $190 billion for the year alone. Why does that company still need to rent GPUs from SpaceX? The answer is a product called Gemini Enterprise. It's Google's flagship agentic AI platform aimed at large corporations and governments, and demand for it exploded far beyond anything Google had modeled. A Google Cloud spokesperson put it plainly. The SpaceX deal was signed, quote, to ensure we have bridge capacity to meet surging customer demand for our agent platform, which has been even higher than we expected. Here's why agentic AI is so uniquely hungry for compute. A standard AI chatbot is a relatively contained transaction. You ask, it answers. An AI agent is something fundamentally different. It reasons through multi-step problems continuously. It holds context across long, complex sessions. It orchestrates multiple tools simultaneously in real time. It validates every output for accuracy, security, and compliance. When you layer all of those processes on top of each other, the computational requirements don't scale linearly, they scale geometrically. Going from a basic AI model to a full agentic workflow can multiply your compute needs by an order of magnitude or more. And Google's engineers tried everything to squeeze more from what they had. They implemented techniques like model co-hosting, running multiple AI models simultaneously on the same physical GPU hardware, dynamically loading and unloading them to handle shifting traffic patterns. Smart engineering. But no amount of software optimization was going to solve a hardware shortage of this magnitude. And there's a second layer to this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Inside Alphabet, there isn't just one team competing for compute. There are many. The core Google Search Infrastructure team, the dedicated Gemini Foundational Model research teams, external Google Cloud Enterprise customers paying real money for AI capacity, and Anthropic, the AI startup that Google has invested billions into, which also draws from Google's hardware pool. All of them are pulling from the same finite reserve of silicon simultaneously. The consequence of that internal rationing? Some of Google's best researchers, genuinely world-class AI scientists, have reportedly been leaving for competitors. Not because of the salary, because at competitors, they get more compute access. And in AI research right now, compute access is oxygen. You can have the most brilliant mind in the field, but if you can't run your experiments at scale, you fall behind. That's the environment Google is operating in. And even with a capital expenditure budget that would dwarf the GDP of many countries, Google simply cannot build data centers fast enough. You can't conjure land permits overnight. You can't connect to an already strained power grid on demand. You can't physically install and cool hundreds of thousands of GPUs in weeks. The physical world has speed limits, and the AI demand curve has completely blown through them. That is why the check exists. That is what $920 million a month actually buys: time. This brings us to the second major insight: how SpaceX became the supplier and the stunning financial double play that makes this whole story something entirely different from what it appears to be. So, how does a rocket company end up as the world's largest GPU landlord? The answer traces back to early 2026 and one of the most aggressive corporate pivots in modern business history. SpaceX executed a full merger with xAI, Elon Musk's standalone artificial intelligence company. xAI had been building something called the Colossus Supercomputer Complex, those two massive facilities in Memphis and South Haven. Built at a breathtaking pace, loaded with the most advanced Nvidia hardware available, H100s, H200s, and next-generation GB200 systems, the absolute bleeding edge of what exists. Originally constructed to train and serve xAI's Grok AI models, these facilities had evolved into something the entire technology industry was desperately hunting for: large-scale, turnkey, ready-to-deploy GPU capacity. The merger logic was straightforward in hindsight. xAI was burning capital at an enormous rate buying Nvidia hardware. SpaceX needed AI infrastructure for its own autonomous systems, for Starship, for Starlink routing, for the Colossus operations themselves. Combining them solved both problems. The deal closed in early 2026, creating a combined entity valued at $1.25 trillion, with xAI's Grok platform, the Colossus infrastructure, and even the social network X all folded into SpaceX's corporate umbrella. And then SpaceX did something nobody fully anticipated. Instead of consuming all that capacity internally, it started renting it out at premium rates to the biggest names in AI. The Google deal wasn't even the first. Weeks before Google's contract was disclosed, SpaceX had already signed a deal with Anthropic, $1.25 billion per month for access to over 220,000 Nvidia GPUs from the Colossus One facility, running through May 2029. That's Anthropic paying SpaceX more than Google is for twice as many GPUs. Now let's add these numbers together, because this is where things get genuinely staggering. Google, $920 million a month, Anthropic, $1.25 billion a month. Combined, $2.17 billion flowing into SpaceX every single month. That annualizes to over $26 billion, entirely from renting out GPU clusters to two clients. To put that number in context, Starlink, SpaceX's satellite internet business that took years to build and now serves over 12 million subscribers worldwide, generated $11.4 billion in revenue in 2025. The new compute leasing division is now on track to generate more than double Starlink's annual revenue through just two contracts. Let that land for a moment. SpaceX, in the span of a few months, has built an AI infrastructure business that financially dwarfs the satellite internet empire it spent a decade constructing. The tenant became the landlord. The rocket company became the hyperscaler. And now let's talk about the 2021 reversal, because the historical symmetry here is remarkable. In May of 2021, Google Cloud and SpaceX announced their first major partnership, but at that time the roles were completely inverted. SpaceX was the one paying Google for cloud infrastructure to run Starlink. SpaceX was physically installing Starlink ground stations inside Google's data centers. Thomas Kurian, then the CEO of Google Cloud, publicly celebrated the win, saying SpaceX chose Google because of the quality of our network. In 2026, Google is renting 110,000 GPUs from the company it once hosted. The former tenant is now the landlord, and the former landlord is now the tenant. Now here's the part that I think is genuinely the most underappreciated piece of this entire story, because most people look at this deal and see Google writing a $30 billion check to a competitor, and they stop there. But that framing misses a layer of financial architecture that has been quietly compounding for over a decade. In January 2015, Google and Fidelity Investments made a combined $1 billion investment into SpaceX. At the time, SpaceX was valued at just $12 billion. Alphabet, Google's parent, took roughly a 7.5% stake. Fidelity took the rest. Now, fast forward to the end of 2025. Despite 11 years of funding rounds that diluted early investors, Alphabet had retained a 6.11% stake in SpaceX, and SpaceX was preparing for an IPO targeting a valuation of between $1.75 and $2 trillion. 6.11% of $2 trillion. Do that math. Somewhere between $100 billion and $122 billion. From an original investment of roughly $750 million. That's a return of 64 to 100 times the original stake. But here's the part that makes this a truly elegant financial structure. Every dollar Google pays SpaceX for compute capacity directly strengthens SpaceX's revenue profile, which drives the IPO narrative, which inflates the valuation, which inflates the value of Alphabet's own equity position. Google is enriching SpaceX with one hand and watching its $100 billion investment appreciate with the other. The payment and the payoff are the same transaction. Before this deal, sophisticated Wall Street traders were actually using Alphabet stock as a proxy bet on the SpaceX IPO, because for most investors, the only accessible way to gain exposure to a $2 trillion SpaceX was to buy Google shares and benefit from the embedded stake. This is not a coincidence. It is one of the most intricate financial double plays I've encountered in years of covering these industries.
This brings us to the third and final insight, and this is the one that genuinely stretches the imagination, because it forces a question that sounds like science fiction but is rapidly becoming a serious engineering conversation. What happens when Earth itself becomes the bottleneck for artificial intelligence? Think about what's happening at ground level right now. Every major AI company is racing to build data centers as fast as physically possible, and they are all running into the same walls. Land is scarce. Power grids in major markets are already at capacity. In some regions, governments are blocking new data center construction entirely because the local grid simply cannot absorb the load. Water for cooling is a mounting environmental and regulatory problem. You can have all the capital in the world and still spend years waiting for permits, power connections, and physical infrastructure to catch up to your ambitions. SpaceX's answer to all of this? Leave the planet. In early June 2026, Elon Musk unveiled specifications for the AI-1, SpaceX's first-generation orbital data center satellite, and the numbers are extraordinary. The AI-1 is wider than a Boeing 747, 70 meters, about 230 feet, tip to tip across its solar arrays. It generates up to 150 kilowatts of continuous power from those panels, drawing on near constant solar exposure in low Earth orbit, without any day-night interruption. And instead of consuming enormous quantities of water for cooling the way every ground-based data center does, the AI-1 radiates waste heat directly into the vacuum of space using a specialized liquid radiator system. No land permits, no grid connection required, no water consumption. Solar power as the energy source and the vacuum itself as an infinite heat sink. It's an engineering solution that simply isn't possible on the ground.
And SpaceX is not thinking small about this. They've broken ground on a facility in Bastrop, Texas called the Gigasat Factory, 11 million square feet of advanced manufacturing capacity on over 1,000 acres, built specifically to produce these orbital data center satellites at industrial scale. The target is 1 gigawatt of space-based AI compute deployed by the end of 2027. By 2030, Musk has publicly stated the goal is 100 gigawatts of deployment per year, eventually scaling toward terawatt-level computing driven entirely by solar power in orbit. And both Google and Anthropic are reportedly in active discussions with SpaceX to be early clients for this orbital capacity. The same two companies funding the terrestrial Colossus complex today are already exploring what it looks like to rent compute from satellites tomorrow. Now, let me be direct about the valuation debate here, because there are serious and credible people on both sides. SpaceX filed its IPO in May 2026, targeting a valuation of between $1.75 and $2 trillion, listing on NASDAQ under the ticker SPCX at $135 per share, aiming to raise $75 to $80 billion. Post-IPO, Elon Musk retains 85.1% of the voting power. The bull case is that $26 billion in annualized high-margin recurring revenue from blue-chip clients like Google and Anthropic, disclosed strategically just days before the IPO, transforms SpaceX's equity story from rocket company to AI infrastructure giant. That narrative is worth a very different multiple. The bear case comes from voices like NYU finance professor Aswath Damodaran, one of the most respected valuation experts alive. He argues the $2 trillion price tag bakes in assumptions of perpetual hardware shortages and uninterrupted growth that may not hold. His more conservative fundamental value? Around $1.3 trillion.
That's still enormous, but it represents a $700 billion gap, depending on which set of assumptions you believe. What I'll say is this: regardless of where the IPO ultimately settles, the structural narrative has changed permanently. SpaceX is no longer pitching itself as a launch company with satellite internet on the side. It is presenting itself as foundational AI infrastructure, and it has the client list to back that claim up.
All right, let's pull all of these threats together. 3 takeaways I want you to carry with you from today. Takeaway number 1. The AI compute shortage is a structural crisis, not a supply chain blip.
When a company with a $190 billion annual infrastructure budget, its own custom chip program, and one of the most advanced cloud networks ever built still can't keep up with demand, you are not looking at a temporary problem. You are looking at a demand curve that has outrun the physical world's ability to respond. The most important resource in the AI race right now is not algorithms or talent alone. It is silicon. Whoever controls access to the GPUs at scale controls the pace of the entire race. And right now, that shortage is so acute, it is driving elite researchers out of some of the most prestigious labs in the world. Takeaway number 2. The boundaries between hardware, software, space, and AI companies have dissolved. The most powerful compute landlord in the world in 2026 is a rocket company. The firm that for decades set the standard for cloud infrastructure is now a tenant. This is not an anomaly. It is the new normal. The companies that will dominate the next decade are the ones that can vertically integrate across every layer, from orbital infrastructure down to the AI model running at the edge. SpaceX is the only commercial entity on Earth with the launch cadence, the constellation operations experience, and now the compute infrastructure to potentially execute orbital AI at scale. Nobody else is even close to that combination. Takeaway number 3. Never read a headline number without understanding the financial architecture underneath it. Google paying SpaceX $30 billion looks, on the surface, like a desperate act, a technology giant humbled by its own compute crisis. But zoom out and you see something entirely different. You see a company that invested in SpaceX when it was worth $12 billion, held through 11 years of dilution, and is now sitting on a stake worth potentially over $100 billion at IPO. And every dollar of that monthly rent check strengthens the valuation that makes that stake more valuable. That's not desperation. That is one of the most sophisticated long-horizon financial strategies in modern corporate history.
We are living through a moment where the physical limits of Earth, land, water, power, are colliding head-on with the exponential demands of artificial intelligence. The data centers powering the models reshaping medicine, science, finance, and daily life are bumping up against the carrying capacity of our terrestrial infrastructure. That is not hyperbole. That is the engineering and economic reality that produced a $30 billion deal between the world's most powerful search company and a firm that builds rockets. And the response to that reality, to migrate computing infrastructure into low Earth orbit, powered by the sun, cooled by the void of space, unconstrained by any permit or grid, is either the boldest infrastructure vision of the 21st century or an ambitious bet on a future that remains further away than its architects suggest. Maybe both. What is certain is that the companies at the center of this story are already making trillion-dollar wagers on the answer. And the next frontier of AI infrastructure may not be in a data center campus in Virginia or Oregon or Texas. It may be orbiting 400 miles above all of them. The AI arms race is reshaping the physical world, and the next battlefield, it turns out, might be space itself. That is Mindcast for today. I'm Will. Thank you for being here. A quick transparency note. The research powering this episode comes from a confidential institutional analysis of the Alphabet-SpaceX partnership. That report is not publicly available, so you won't find a link to it in the show notes. What you will find are references to the SEC filings, news coverage, and public sources we drew on, so you can go deeper on any thread that caught your attention. If this episode gave you something new to think about, the best thing you can do is subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss what's next. And if someone in your life would find this valuable, send it their way. That's genuinely how this show grows. Until next time.